I'll actually start with Bobbi, and then maybe we'll just make our way down the row here. But just starting again with backgrounds, can each of you share a little bit about who you are and highlight one thing that your culture has instilled in you that's helped you become who you are today?
Okay, well that's a big question. And Matt, thank you, and to the Asia team, thank you for putting on this event, and Tom for your sponsorship of the group. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about where I'm from, and to give you some context about how culture has influenced me. I grew up in Sacramento, California, so not very far from here, and I'm one of 5 children. My parents are from Japan originally, and actually my mother was born and raised there, but my father was a very interesting story. He was born in California, but when he was 7, he and his family went to visit his relatives in Japan. And while they were there, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so they ended up staying in Japan for 14 years. And I guess there are kind of 2 good things that came out of that. One is that my family, my father's family, didn't have to go to the internment camps like many Japanese families in the United States did. And he also met my mother. So I think about the fact that if the Japanese hadn't bombed Pearl Harbor, would I be here today? One of those big philosophical questions that you ask yourself. My dad, when my parents married, and my mother was now pregnant with my oldest sister, and my dad said, you know what, we're Americans, we're going to go to America. And so he applied to come back to the United States, and what he discovered was that the U.S. Army was very interested in drafting him if he wanted to come back to the U.S. And so it was fortunately not wartime, and so my dad was sent to what was then West Germany and lived there for a couple years in the Army. And then when he got out of the Army, he asked for my mother to come to the United States, and she came with his family, his parents and his sister. So there were 5 basically immigrants, moved to a working class neighborhood in Sacramento, and then my parents ended up having 5 kids. And I was the 3rd child, and I was also the 3rd girl, which for an Asian family was not the surprise that they wanted. And so my father actually didn't come to the hospital the day I was born. I think I still haven't gotten over that, but that's a whole nother story. And I was, my first 5 years of my life, my mother and my grandfather, my father's father, my mother only spoke Japanese, my grandfather only spoke Japanese and Spanish, and so I grew up as Japanese is my first language, so I didn't really start speaking English regularly until I went to elementary school. And so that's a little bit about, you know, who I am. I think my parents recognized that education was really important, and it was going to be the way that I was going to have a different life than they did. And so I'm really glad that they encouraged me to study hard and to go to school and to do well and to take advantage of what America had to offer. So I'm kind of like a classic American, you know, child of an immigrant story. I think the biggest thing that I got from really my mother, and I think this is quintessentially Japanese, although I don't think that the Japanese corner the market on this, is this notion of accountability. And I think if you look at Japanese politicians or heads of companies, that oftentimes if they misspeak or a disaster happens, that they step down or they say, I'm accountable in a real way, that they own it. And I think that's something that my mother really impressed upon me, was to, like if something didn't go right, she'd always say, well, how do you think you contributed to that? Or if I would do kind of a half-hearted job on something, she would say, well, do you think that's done to your satisfaction? And it's something that has really stuck with me. And I think if you ask anybody who works on my team, they will probably say that the one thing that I do really hold in high regard is being accountable. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Naveen, same question.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Janet, for setting this up. This is my first time here presenting to you guys and talking to you. So let me give you a little brief background. So I come from a very small town in Kashmir in India. So I don't know how many of you know about Kashmir. Kashmir is right now not in the best of lights because of the conflict that it has between Muslim and Hindus. But time for me growing up was a beautiful time for me. You know, I grew up in a time which was considered a paradise of Asia, so it's a really beautiful place to live in, but very isolated in terms of culturally, as well as in terms of even from the rest of India, we were really isolated. So we thought of ourselves as a country in itself. And growing up, I'm a first generation immigrant here, so I came here in '94. For me, the big thing was, for my parents, was education. So I think you heard that story from Bobbi as well. From our community, we are like 2% population of the Hindus, and there are 98% Muslims in Kashmir. And the 2% Hindu population in Kashmir is 100% educated, have at least a graduate degree, if not master's. So the level of competition and the level of education instilled in you is very, very high. And the regard for success and excelling in what you do is extremely high. So that work ethic of doing really well in whatever you do and not taking shortcuts in what you do was instilled in me at a very, very young age. And so I brought that to this country. But what has been really fascinating for me for a person being a first generation immigrant coming into this country was it was always fascinating to me to come to America. And early on I used to watch shows like Cosmos. I don't know if any of you have seen Cosmos. It was about a show by Carl Sagan about astrophysics. And that was a wondrous experiment. It's kind of nerdy for me, but I liked it. And then and it really encapsulated for me what America meant in the terms of the wonder of what you can achieve. So I still remember distinctly the day I arrived. In fact, I came from Delhi, arrived in Arkansas, of all places, in the middle of winter, where there is a single airport and a single lane, and in the middle of winter, so there are no birds, and there are a lot of signs everywhere, which, you know, coming from India, there are no signs anywhere. So there are a lot of signs, and there are a lot of fast food joints, and a lot of low-rise buildings. So this was not my experience or my initial thought process of what America was all about. But what it really inculcated me once I started working for Walmart and ultimately worked in Bay Area for 10 years for Silicon Valley companies was the American dream. And I came in with one suitcase, I remember, and I had a pressure cooker. I don't know if many of you know what a pressure cooker is. It's used to make rice. I never made rice in that, but I brought it with me. And so that was what I brought with me when I came to US. And I was pretty confident that if I worked hard and I had the right aptitude, I thought I had the talent, I would succeed here. And I think America, for me personally, I have always felt really appreciative of the fact that I have gotten the opportunities through the years, because in America, regardless of where you are, what color you are, what race you are, talent speaks for a lot of it. What you can produce, what you can deliver, how you can lead and inspire people speaks to a lot of it. And so that's been my story.
No, thank you. I think Janet and I had the opportunity to sit with each of these leaders and talk to them prior to this meeting. And so we've heard some of these stories, but hearing them again, I'm learning so much more.